Somebody get us caught up in the book of Joshua. I forgot where we are. Does anybody know? No, I know that. I'm pretending that I don't know what's happened so far in the book of Joshua so you can help me out. Yeah, and that's what tonight's a lot of fighting. A lot of fighting going on tonight. There was kind of a non-fight going on last week. Yeah, walk around the city and all of a sudden the walls fall down flat. What's that? Yeah, yeah, it is. Be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous, be strong and courageous. Yeah, they sent out some good spies for a change. They sent out those 12, and 10 of them were duds. And so they sent out 2 good spies this time. And they came back with a report about Jericho. And the Israelites marched around Jericho once a day for 6 days, 7 times on the 7th day, blew their horns and shouted, and walls came tumbling down. And what were God's instructions concerning the city of Jericho? Everything is to be eliminated. All the people, and you are to take none of the spoil. Don't touch anything in the city of Jericho. It's under the ban. There was an exception to all of the people. And what was the exception to all the people? Rahab and her family, those who were with her, that followed the instructions to be with her in her house, and she had that cord, that string hanging out, and those people were spared. And it's a good thing, because how does she figure in the rest of the story? All the way down to the lineage of Jesus through David and on down to Jesus. And so it was a significant thing that she was spared. God knew what kind of person she was, even in Jericho. Here's the city of Jericho, and you know there aren't a whole lot of good people in Jericho, but God saw this one woman and knew her heart and made arrangements for her to survive this destruction, for her and her family, and to become part of the lineage of Jesus, the ancestry of Jesus. And so wherever there's a good heart, God can find it, even in Jericho. What happens next? There's a guy named Achan. And what does Achan do wrong? The ban was you do not take anything. You don't touch anything. You don't take any spoil for yourself. Generally, when there was a battle, the victorious army would take the spoil from the defeated army and from the defeated cities. But for Jericho, God said, don't touch it. But Achan took some of the things under the ban. That's just mentioned just in passing in verse 1. Now Joshua sends some spies to the next town, and the next town is Ai. And the spies go to Ai near Bethel. And they came back, and what did they say? We don't need to exert ourselves. We just need 2,000 or 3,000 men go up. I mean, we're not even going to break a sweat. This is going to be simple. It's just a little village, and we just go in and take them out and go on our way. And so about 3,000 of them went to Ai, and what happened? They turned and ran and fled, and the people of men of Ai followed them and killed 36 of them. What did that do to the hearts of the Israelites? They melted and became as water. Whatever happened to be strong and courageous? Yeah, they got just a little bit proud here, and they suffered the consequence. Yeah, they weren't necessarily trusting on God here, because they counted their numbers. You know, they calculated how many do we need so that we can beat this town. And if they would have come up with we need about 1 plus God, then that would have been a good thing. But 3,000 and not God is not a good number.
But it also says that the reason why they weren't able to do it is
Yeah, and that's because God wasn't with them. That's the key factor in this whole thing is the one. It's whatever number plus one, and it's the plus one that really turns the tide, makes all the difference in the world. Joshua is frustrated, to say the least. He tears his clothes. He falls down before the ark. Stays there until the evening, and the leaders, the elders of Israel do that, and they put dust on their heads. And Joshua cries out to God, and what does he say? Why did you bring us here just to destroy us? We should have just let us stay on the other side of the Jordan, on the east side of the Jordan. But you brought us over here to be defeated and destroyed. If we would have just been willing to stay over there, how are we going to do anything now? Israel has turned and run from their enemies. Everybody's going to hear about it. Now, you remember Jericho. What did Rahab say was going on in Jericho? They were scared to death. And so Rahab reported that Jericho, which was a mighty city, was scared. But now the rumor is going to spread that Israel loses and that they can't even take a little tiny village. Chuck?
Joshua was asking the wrong questions here, because God had promised to be with him and everything, and he's not understanding what happened here, because God was supposed to be with them, but God let him be defeated. He wasn't asking the right questions. Why did this happen? God told him, but he wasn't understanding. That's a huge blow to your command abilities. Whenever you have a situation like this happen, because now it's going to make it that much more difficult for the people to trust him and to follow him.
Yeah, this has really harmed his credibility as a leader, because here they go to try to defeat this city, and they're defeated that way. And so you're right. It's going to be a blow to his leadership. And you can just imagine how he felt. You go from a real high. Can you imagine how you would have felt emotionally if you would have been there at the destruction of Jericho, and you saw those walls just fall down flat, and how that would make you feel? And then you go to some little teeny tiny burg, and they defeat you. And you go from way up here to way down there, and he just, all the wind is out of his sails. And what did God say? He said, get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they've also transgressed my covenant, and they've taken some of the things under the ban and stolen and deceived. Now, how many people did that, technically? One. But God said, you did. You did. And when there's sin in the camp, it has an impact on everybody else. And we get back to that statement you hear sometimes, well, what I do is my own business. It doesn't affect anybody else. It doesn't bother anybody else. I can just do whatever I want to. Yeah. No, I don't think so at all. It reminds me a little bit of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Elijah has had that confrontation on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal and everything. And how'd that go? That went great. I mean, he eliminated them. There's another one of these real high experiences. And then Jezebel says, I'm going to get you, and so he runs and hides. And he cries out to God, I'm the only one left. And God basically said, get up and get going. I've got a job for you to do. Just get up and get busy doing it. I've got 7,000 people just like you out there. Don't sit around and cry about it. And that's kind of what God says to Joshua, isn't it? Get over it. You sinned. This is the consequence. Fix it, and it'll be better. But he points out in verse 12 there of Joshua 7 that as long as this in the camp, Israel can't stand before their enemies. They're going to lose. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy the things under the ban from your midst. So get up and get busy finding what's going on.
Also, since this was under the ban, and Achan took this, goes back to, God had set aside those things as holy, or his, and then Achan made them common. So it kind of goes back to our study of Leviticus.
Yeah.
You can't have the unholy in the holy.
Right, commingling the holy with the unholy. And that's true because under the ban is a specific situation of something that's set aside for God. This is God's. And so by placing it under the ban, God was saying, this is mine. Don't touch it. And so, yeah, it was a significant thing that he did. He just didn't just take some spoils that just nobody was going to use anyway. And what do you think his rationalization might have been? Nobody will ever know was probably one of the first ones. What a waste. What a waste. All that stuff. It's just to leave it lying there, and nobody's going to know. What's it going to hurt? What good's it going to be? He can't wear it. Is he going to wear this clothes that shouts, I took you from Jericho? All of a sudden he has a big bank account? What good's it going to do him? And you wonder sometimes when we do the same things, when we make mistakes like that, make wrong choices. And then, what's that? I think he acted very impulsively, and he did not bother to think about it. And so the next day they started sorting people out by family, which is what they did in a situation like this. You remember a similar situation with Saul, and God wasn't listening, and so they sorted it out by family and got it down to Saul and Jonathan, casting lots and so forth to get down to the person. And so they start going by family and by person and household, and they got down to Achan. And what did Joshua say to Achan? Give glory to God. Just admit what you've done. Tell us what you've done. Give praise and glory to God. Do not hide it from me. And so Achan at least confessed what he had done. And notice what he says in verse 20. He has sinned against the Lord, the God of Israel. Do you remember when Joseph was being tempted by Potiphar's wife? And what he said in response, how can I do this against God? He said, this is what I saw. I saw a beautiful mantle from Shinar. This probably had gold thread in it. He would never have worn this thing. Never, ever had an occasion to wear this. And 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold, 50 shekels. And I coveted them and took them, and they're concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it. That's a lot of weight of stuff. 200 shekels would be like, that's a lot smaller, between a $50 and a silver dollar is what a shekel was. Size, the coin that they finally did that was a shekel. Yeah, is there anything? Yeah, and then you get into the 50 shekels. 50 shekels are going to weigh 50 shekels, whether it's gold or feathers, but still, it's going to be a lot of stuff to haul around. And so they went, checked it out, and it's exactly as they said. Poured them out before God, and what happened then? He and all those associated with him were stoned and burned with fire after they'd stoned them with stones. And so the next time we're tempted to say, what I do is my own business, it doesn't affect anybody else, we need to rethink that. Because that's just not the case. What we do has an impact on a lot of other people. And we just need to be conscious of that fact. Whenever I read that story, I always compare it with the story of Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament. I think there's some strong similarities. As Israel is entering the promised land, the first thing they confront is greed, covetousness on the part of Achan. And God makes it clear that I will not be with you if you do not clean house. The church is the beginning of the new promised land in the New Testament, and one of the first things the church runs into is what? Ananias and Sapphira. They are covetous. They want to say they gave everything to God, but they didn't. They wanted to keep some for themselves. They didn't have the dedication to give it all to God. They wanted the praise for giving it all to God, but they didn't want to give it up. And so, to me, there are a lot of parallels between entering the Canaan and entering the new kingdom. And God's caution right at the beginning against what? Covetousness and greed.
I still want to think that Sapphira would have said and done the right thing for the story would have been different.
Oh yeah, if she would have,
Even though she's his wife, it still would
yeah, she could have, her destiny was dependent on her statement about it. But Paul says in Colossians and Ephesians that greed and covetousness are idolatry, and they're not tolerated. God does not tolerate idolatry. This Achan placed those things above God. Those clothes, that mantle, and the gold and the silver he placed above God because God said, do this with it, and he decided to do whatever he wanted to with it. And so that was his form of idolatry. In chapter 8, God says, don't worry about it. Don't fear, be dismayed. Go up to Ai, and you're going to defeat them just as you did Jericho and your king. And so this time, they took an army with them, and they set up a plan to ambush them from behind, to pretend that they were fleeing, and then they would draw everybody out of the town. Then they had another group waiting in ambush, and they were going to go back and burn the city. So they had a pretty good battle plan here. And so at the signal, the people who were hidden came out, and the people of Ai were trapped. And so they were able to defeat Ai and Bethel that was nearby.
You know, I was thinking, here God tells them to take a large army, however many thousand, well, this is supposed to be a small place. We find out later on that they killed 12,000 men and women.
Yeah.
That wasn't all that small.
Yeah.
But anyway, what I'm getting at was, it's here, God is telling Joshua to take all these people for this smaller town. But then over in Judges, he does just the opposite.
Yeah.
He takes a few men for a large army, so they wouldn't think that they done it under their own strength. I just struck me with
Yeah,
that.
and I don't have any explanation for that. I don't know why God thinks the way he does or does the things that he does. But one thing that occurs to me is that they really need to make a point. That they've made a point by being defeated that all the other cities are going to laugh at them and think that they're, that they can't win a battle. And so maybe by doing it this way, it makes a point to the other cities around, hey, that was a mistake. This is who we really are. And you really need to be afraid of us. So I don't know. I don't know why God chose to do that. And then I do know the reason that with Gideon, it was because he did not want them to think it was the size of their army that won. And here, I don't think that's a problem. I don't think that's in question right here, because I don't think they're going to think that they've seen what happens when God's not with them. And so I think that they don't need to be taught that lesson. They can just go ahead with their full army and go in.
It doesn't indicate that Joshua asked God about it. It sounds like you just decided,
Yeah.
let's just take a few.
Yeah, yeah. And that may be the case too.
I was speculating, we don't know, but if Joshua at the beginning of chapter 7
Yeah,
had gone to God, maybe God at that time would have said, wait, we have to wait because there's, things in the camp, that we need to take care of.
yes. And I thought I had that question on here. It's not on here, but you'll find it in a minute. Because how could this thing all gone differently? That's basically what you're talking about. How could their encounter with AI have gone differently? What all they needed to do to have a totally different outcome was what? Ask God. Oh, I know where it'll come out later with Gibeon, I guess. With Gibeon. But the same thing's true with AI. If they would have just asked God, then he could have told them, don't bother because you're not going to win, no matter how many people you take with you. Then they would have looked for the solution. Yeah.
I guess at that time he didn't know that Gibeon had taken it.
No, he didn't. He maybe had no reason to expect that, but at the same time, if we would make it a habit to talk to God first, not just on occasions, like, hey, I think I might need some help this time, so I'm going to ask you, but today, I'm fine. I got it made, so I don't need your help today. And you wonder how many times we do that. We turn to God on big things, and we don't turn to God in the little things, when it would be a very good habit to always go to God and always seek God's instruction and always seek God's direction and all those things. I think that would make a difference in the outcome here and with the Gibeonites especially. But I think you're exactly right. The last part of chapter 8 there in Joshua describes what Joshua has done to fulfill God's commandment through Moses. God has commanded them through Moses to do what? To set up an altar on Mount Ebal. And later there'll be an exchange on Mount Ebal and Gerizim where they have a back and forth chorus of cursings and blessings. But with this altar up on Mount Ebal, it's built according to certain specifications, and he wrote there on the stones what? A copy of the law of Moses, which would probably be the Ten Commandments. And he wrote it in the presence of the Israelites, and so they knew it was there. And we've been noticing all along that there'll be monuments set up, and sometimes it'll say, this is so that your children will ask, what does this mean? And then you will tell them, this is what this means. The stones that they took out of the Jordan when they crossed through and they set it up on the side, it says that when your children ask, what do these stones mean? You will tell them that God took us across the Jordan on dry land. The Passover and all the things in the Passover, it says that when your children ask, why are we doing this? You will tell them, this is because God brought us out of slavery this way. And here's an altar that's not necessarily an altar to offer regular sacrifices on, but it is to be, it's a monument, it's a reminder for people to know, well, I don't know what the law says. Well, I know one place you can go find out, because it's written on stone there at Mount Ebal. And so they offered burnt offerings there that time, and he wrote the law there, and they were standing on either side. Here's, it just mentions, I guess, Gerizim and Ebal here. And they read the blessing and the curse. And in verse 35 is an important statement, because what does it say that they did? Everything that Moses had commanded, Joshua did it. There was not a single thing that he did not read. Not only to the leaders, but with the women and the little ones and the strangers who were living among them. Nobody had an excuse. They couldn't say, well, we just didn't know. They all knew. Beginning in chapter 9, different nations start forming alliances against the Israelites. In chapter 9, verse 1, it mentions some of the nations that began to form these alliances together to fight against Joshua and Israel. And who are they? The Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, and they're all gathering together. And I've mentioned before about the Hittites. That was critics of the Bible said, I think until the 1800s, sometime in the 1800s, the Bible is so wrong. It mentions these people as if they were significant. There was no such group of people as the Hittites. The Bible just made that up as some little teeny tiny tribe somewhere maybe. Then they started discovering exactly who the Hittites were. They're the ones who started inventing iron and using iron weapons and tools and things. They were not some little insignificant nobody. The Bible's been right all along, but archaeologists have only been right for the last century or two. Yeah, and that's our response. If the Bible says it, you know the story of the man who discovered the paths of the sea, charted the currents in the sea. He was in the hospital and he was reading about the paths of the sea, and he said, they must be there somewhere. And so he went out and started charting the currents. Now there is a one city that chooses a different approach. The Hittites and these others are going to fight them. They're going to form this alliance to fight them. But the Gibeonites have a different idea. And what's their idea? If you can't lick them, join them. And so what do? What's that? Yeah, they lied about who they are. Somebody have a question?
Who is the Gibeon? What among these ones mentioned here? Where do they fall in at? Do you know?
No, they're just in that same general area around Jericho and Ai because they were nearby. And that's
But they're
it's a city. It's a city. It's not, the Hittites is a whole,
okay.
like the Philistines and the Hittites, but the Gibeonites would be the inhabitants of it's a significant town. It's an important town, but it's more of a town than a nation.
But they're part of one of
The Canaanites that live in that same area. Now, I don't know exactly what their background is. They've heard about Jericho and they've heard about Ai, and so what do? They send some envoys, and they make sure they're wearing old, worn-out sandals, and their wine jugs or water jugs are old and cracked, and their bread, they make sure they start out with bread that's already crusty and old. And they show up at the Israelite camp, and what do they say? Oh, we came from a far country. You can tell by looking at us. Look at our sandals. They're all worn out. And look at the bread that we have. It was warm when we took it out of the oven. We took it straight out of the oven and started our trip. And look at it. And our wineskins, they were brand new and stretchy, and they were really great wineskins when we started out. Look at them now. They're just old and cracked and worn out. So that's how far we've come from. We've come from a long ways away. We've been traveling a long time. And so what did Joshua do? He didn't ask God. He made a covenant with them, and this time it says specifically in verse 14 of chapter 9 what his problem was. He did not ask the counsel of the Lord, which would have been true, I'm sure, in the case of Ai too. But here it comes out and says that he did not ask God about this. All he would have had to do is say, hey, God, there's this group of people, and they say they've come from a long distance. Now, you told us not to make an agreement, a pact with any of these local people, and so we don't want to do that. But these people aren't from around here. They're from way far away. Would it be okay if we go ahead and make a pact with them? And God would have said, no, because they're lying to you. But he did not ask It seemed insignificant, didn't it? Didn't seem like just a small deal. And then the Israelites set out and they arrive at the cities that Gibeon and the cities that are associated with them, but they couldn't do anything to them. And so they had to let them live. They made them into slaves, but at least they were able to live. And Joshua confronted them and said, "Why have you deceived us and say that you came from far land when you're living right around here? Now you're going to be slaves forever." And what was their response? Yeah, we're afraid for our lives. We know what the Lord your God has commanded Moses. Moses, how'd they know that? Everybody knows, I guess. But they know that God had commanded Moses to not let these people live, to wipe them out. And so we were afraid. We were fearing for our lives. We're in your hands. Do as you see fit. And so they couldn't kill them. At the beginning of chapter 10, we see another alliance. And is led by the king of Jerusalem. It mentions there in verse 2 that Gibeon was a significant city. And so he sent word to other kings and said, "Come help me, let us attack Gibeon," because they made a peace treaty with Joshua. And so those 5 kings came up. What do the people of Gibeon say? "You have to protect us. We're your slaves. You're obligated to protect us now. You can't abandon us." And so Joshua went up, and what did God tell Joshua? Don't be afraid of them. Don't fear them. Not one of them will stand before you. What did Joshua do so he could help the Gibeonites? In verse 9 there, they marched all night. They marched all night to confront the enemy. Describe the battle. This is one of those typical God battles. I mean, how many times do we see a battle like this, that the two sides meet and then it's over? It doesn't. There's no long drawn out, so and so flanked such and such, and then somebody came around, and there's no battle here. They go and the other people lose and start running. And that's how it is when God is in charge. And God sent hailstones from heaven, large hailstones, and that killed more people than the sword did. They needed a little bit more time to finish the job, and so what happened? Joshua said, "Sun, stand still at Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ayalon." And so the sun and the moon stopped, which is a bigger miracle than we realize, because that has to do with gravity and all sorts of things. But all we know is that it's true, that it happened. We don't know how. By the way, NASA did not find a lost day. That's a real popular thing, that NASA was doing some calculations and there was a glitch and they couldn't get things to work out, and they worked on it, and finally they discovered that there was a missing day. And this was the missing day. That's not true. So anyway, thought I'd throw that in there in case. That is a book that we have no clue what that is. When you find out, be sure and let me know. Because I don't know what it is, and this isn't the only place I don't think that we run into it. The sun stood still, the moon stood still, gave them enough time to finish the job. They just threw the kings in a cave in the meantime and then came back and dealt with them later. And then we have in quick succession the army just going to city after city after city. In verse 28 of chapter 10, He goes to Makkedah, and then he goes to Libnah, and then he goes to Lachish. And you just see the list. It goes on and on and on as God marches Israel through the land. And they return to Gilgal. And so in chapter 11, here's another alliance forming. Everybody is out to get Israel, and they have good reason, because Israel's going to wipe all of them out. And so Jabin the king of Hazor heard about it, and he sends word to other kings of other areas. This is a pretty massive alliance that he's talking about here. This includes the Hittites, which would be eastern Turkey, which is way up north. And you clear down the Canaanites. The Jebusites would be around Jerusalem. The Arabah would be the whole area, that Jordan River Valley that goes to the Dead Sea and beyond. South of Chinnereth in verse 2 would be the Sea of Galilee. It's another name for the Sea of Galilee. This is a big, big alliance. And so what does God tell Joshua? Don't worry. Yep, it'll be taken care of. Don't be afraid. Tomorrow I will deliver them slain before Israel. And so, how'd this battle go? And the battle itself went about the same as all the other battles. They just kept on rolling along. Other armies just ran. And so they just kept on marching and marching and taking over the enemy.
Gary, is this, am I right in thinking this, that they had the main battle where they had all the kings and everything, and then did Joshua go to individual places?
I think he followed along. I think they probably gathered together, and then as they fled, there really wasn't much of a battle, because as soon as it started, the other army started running back home, I think, and then he'd pursue them there and deal with them. That's the idea I get, that he followed them one by one to their cities, because they didn't do anything to Israel as a group. They just turned and ran. And so Joshua follows God's instructions. You'll notice in chapter 11, verse 14, and all these other cities, they were supposed to take the spoil. That was what they did. And so they were allowed to take the spoil of these other places. If Achan would have just not been so greedy and just waited, he could have had everything he wanted, and he could have used it. Wouldn't have had to hide it.
These were the first fruits, almost, that God wanted. He always wanted the first fruits, it seems, of sacrifices and things. And as they were taking this land over, could you say Jericho was the first fruit?
Yeah, Jericho would be probably the biggest thing of all. It was the first one they took. So yeah, it's a first fruit, but it was set aside for him. Yeah, it was God's first fruit, not theirs. Yeah. Yeah, God always wanted them to give the best to him first, the first fruit or whatever. And that'd be true about Jericho, because Jericho was perhaps the oldest city in the world. And so it was a well-established city. It was a big city, and it had a lot of riches. Yeah.
All that death and destruction that they not required to do, even though God made it necessary, God's commanded them, they still have to do that to be a great toil.
Yeah, I think you're right that this This was not an easy task for the Israelites, although they really didn't have to do much fighting. They did a lot of pursuing and killing and all that kind of stuff. Jesse? No, they didn't have. They wouldn't have been using even like bows and arrows. Probably it's all hand-to-hand combat with swords and lances and clubs, and yeah, it was face-to-face warfare. And you do have to appreciate the physical effort that they put out, Lisa.
How much time elapsed from the fall of Jericho until they rested?
No, I don't. I don't think it's a very long time. But as they begin to divide the land up, it gets to be longer and longer. And finally, Joshua says, "What are you guys waiting for?" And so this first part, I don't think took very long, but it'll drag on and on. I think this is fairly immediate. But you do have to appreciate the effort that the Israelites put out. First of all, to march all night. You know, for an army to just pick up and march all night long to confront an enemy, that was a difficult task, and that alone would have taken. And then they fight all day, and hey, we need an extra. Give us an extra day with it. And so they march all night, and then they fight all day, and then they fight all day. And so you're right. They put a lot of effort into it, and God intended for them to put effort in it. I think because they're gaining the land. God could have just handed it to them, just give them the key, couldn't he? I mean, God can do anything he wants to. He could have said, "Okay, everything's gone. I wiped it out. You can come in and start over." But at least he had them put out the effort. At the end of chapter 11, it summarizes again what Joshua's been doing. And it mentions especially a group of people called the Anakim. Who are the Anakim? This is one of the names for the groups of giants. And so this is one family, one group of giants. And he greatly reduced the number of this group of giants. And it says in verse 22 that there were no Anakim left in the land of the sons of Israel, only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Gaza would be that western side of the Jordan River. That's the Gaza Strip today. But the other two are Philistine cities. There were 5 Philistine cities, and those are 2 of them. And so the giants are eliminated, but there are still some at this time living with. And so that's important, because if it would have said he wiped out all of the giants, and then we start reading the story of David later on, we'd think, where did Goliath come from? Well, there were some left in Gath and Ashdod. I think Gath is actually where Goliath was from, wasn't it? Wasn't he from the city of Gath? And so this is not just one of the 5 cities. This is the one of the 5 cities that Goliath is from. And it says that Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And he gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes, and the land had rest from war. And so they have not captured all the land, but as far as Joshua's involvement in it, they've done what God has said. They've occupied the whole land. Because we're going to see, as the Israelites face certain areas, they're going to come up with some excuses why they don't totally remove all of the population. But Joshua has done his part to conquer and divide the land. It describes there in chapter 12 the area beyond the Jordan toward the sunrise, from the valley of the Arnon as far as Mount Hermon to the north, and all the Arabah to the east. That's that valley again, the Dead Sea Valley that goes all the way down below the Dead Sea. It just describes the area. And it mentions Og there in verse 4, and we'll see him later, I think, too, in another chapter. But who was Og? He was one of the Rephaim, and that's another group of giants. The Anakim, the Rephaim are different groups of giants, and so he's another family of giants. But you remember, isn't Og the one that had the iron bed that was, 9.5 feet long or something, or longer than that? I think Og was the one that had the great big bed. Oh yeah, 12. Yes, 6 fingers and 6 toes on each hand or foot. He was a big guy. And that actually took place before. It's going back to Moses' time. And so there it actually happened before they crossed the river. And then beginning in verse 7, it gets into the land that was conquered after Joshua took over. But you see that long list of kings and of cities, and it sums it up. And how many kings is it? 31 kings. 31 kings that they have defeated, and they've only had one setback, and that setback was Ai, and it was not because the enemy was so strong, it was because they were so weak, because they didn't have God. And so that was the big difference. What lessons can we learn from Israel's experience with the Gibeonites and with Ai? What was that, Don? Always ask God. Always check with God first. Remember, sometimes God's answer is going to be right here in this book you're handing. He's not going to whisper in your ear or appear to you in a dream and any of those things. But the answers are right here. And if you're asking for His guidance and His strength, and you're listening to what He has here, then He has an opportunity to reveal that to you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And that's he gives us all the advice that we need, but we just don't pay attention to it. Surely we know better than He does.
Well, and there's always that thinking, well, maybe I'm paying attention to this, but then you can try for a while, but then pretty soon you see that they're not interested in your
Yeah, and as we said, don't you think that Achan had some rationalizations? And he had to say, this is a big waste, nobody will know. Same things we say every day, unfortunately. We have our rationalizations, excuses for why we don't do something the way it should be done. Well, because of this or because of that. And it never goes well whenever we find an excuse for not doing what God wants us to do. It always goes better if we just rely on Him and do it His way the first time, and then it just works a whole lot better. Thank you very much.